Namaskar and welcome to Indian Diplomacy, a window on India's foreign relations, India's major international partnerships, India's involvement in solving global problems, and also regional and international issues that have an impact on India's security and economic rise. Viewers, in this episode, we are taking up terrorism emanating from Pakistan, impacting Afghanistan, and vice versa, and how this southwestern region of Asia is burning and the situation is getting worse and deteriorating day by day. And to discuss this and how it impacts on India and India's own security and regional position, I have a very special guest joining us all the way from Washington DC via Zoom, Dr. Aparna Pande. Dr. Pande is research fellow at the Hudson Institute, an important think tank in the US, and the author of multiple books, including From Chanakya to Modi and Making India Great. She's a specialist on South Asian affairs. Dr. Pande, welcome to Indian Diplomacy.
Thank you so much, Sreeram. A pleasure to be with you.
So, there has been a massive bomb attack in Peshawar, close to the Afghan border in Pakistan, and more than 100 police persons have been killed. This is one of the worst incidents of terrorism that the region has known, and this is of course a symptom of a much worse problem which is deeper and ingrained, and you've been studying this for a long time, the insecurity, the pervasive insecurity on the AFPAC border region, and now it's getting worse as we speak, and it looks like this is an inferno that's going to burn up many things on both sides of the border and possibly beyond. So why do you think this is peaking right now, and why has all semblance of normalcy just gone for a toss in this region?
Thanks, Sreeram. Pakistan appears to unfortunately be moving towards a full-blown insurgency led by the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan and its various offshoots. Since the return of the Afghan Taliban, if you remember, in August 2021, the Pakistani Taliban resumed their attacks against the state. There have been more attacks in the second half of 21 and all of 2022 than they were in the previous decade. The argument of the Pakistani Taliban is that if the Pakistani state can support the Afghan Taliban for an Islamic state right next door in Afghanistan, then the same Pakistani establishment should also support an Islamic state within Pakistan. The Afghan and Pakistani Taliban are ideological allies. They have close connections, and while the Afghan Taliban has often been asked to mediate ceasefires between the Pakistani state and the Pakistani Taliban, at the end of the day, the Taliban will always choose their ideology and their belief system over pragmatism. Now, the Pakistani state has for decades, as you well know, used jihad and these Islamist groups as a lever of regional foreign policy against India and inside Afghanistan. The Pakistani educational curriculum and the media narrative has created a public opinion that is ambivalent towards terrorism, with a large segment of the Pakistani populace viewing these groups as either those who have been wronged or are simply acting against foreign occupation, be it in Afghanistan or Kashmir or anywhere else. And so the Pakistani state has always followed a 2 steps forward and often 2 or 4 steps backward policy on terrorism. It acts against some groups, it allows other groups to revamp, but it never fully crushes all the groups. Otherwise, a group, the Pakistani Taliban, you refer to the recent attack. Let us go back almost 8 years or 9 years. In December 2014, the Pakistani Taliban attacked and killed children of army officers in the army public school in Peshawar.
Yeah, there were 150 casualties nearly at the time. Yeah,
absolutely. So your children have been killed. This time, this mosque was killed people from police officers' families. So why is it that you do not act against a group that attacks you? Because for the Pakistani establishment, the jihadi groups remain critical in their fight against India. And any attack, unfortunate as it may be within the country, is simply a collateral damage that they are willing to accept for the greater goal of keeping India in check and keeping Afghanistan under their control.
Dr. Pande, You're talking of collateral damage. It's Pakistani citizens, right? And the
Yes.
kinds of attacks that are happening, just the scale and the boldness with which the terrorists are attacking. The Pakistani thinkers are calling it a second wave of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan. But the question is, why are they not able to tame this? I mean, they have counterinsurgencies and operations from time to time. They had done one a few years ago, and now they're again talking of doing this. But they continue to insist that the problem lies across the Durand line on the other side, because the TTP terrorists take shelter on the Afghan side. But that was supposed to have been solved the moment the Afghan Taliban came to power in Kabul, right? But it's not happening. And it looks like, actually, like you said, they've grown bolder. The Pakistani Taliban have grown bolder and are now escalating and upping the ante. So in that sense, Pakistan seems to be in the worst of all positions, because they've got an economic crisis, they are in a deep political dysfunction, and with an interim government, and then they've got this problem now, which is festering and getting bigger and bigger. So it's like the perfect storm, right? I mean, everything that's bad or horrible that Pakistan needs to have is coming together all at a time. And like you said, a lot of it has to do with the mistakes. Rana Sanahullah, the Interior Minister of Pakistan, even admitted after the Peshawar mosque attack that we have to do soul searching, and it's a collective error that we all committed. And so that kind of reflection, self-reflection, self-criticism is also emerging. It's very candid, but the point is, it looks like it's too late now, and the genie is out of the bottle, and a lot of these hardline extremist groups are running amok on that frontier region. So what can they do now to try and bring this down? I mean, they are talking about another series of raids across the border into Afghanistan, and more police operations and military and frontier missions. But I think fundamentally that region may not be controllable. History says that, and looks like the Pakistani state is especially incapable and lacks the vision and the clarity and the unity as a state and a society to be able to hold things together there. So it could break up, isn't it? I mean, there's a potential breakaway of these regions that's been in the offing for a long time. What do you think?
So there are a lot of questions you've thrown at me. So let me sort of clarify some of them. First, the Pakistani state has never, ever cohesively and sort of with a firm hand cracked down on all the groups. It has played favorites. It has cracked down against some groups, but not against others. Sort of all of its various operations in the frontier region, in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa and the FATA region, have been half-hearted. They've been against some groups, but not the others, and they've allowed many of the groups at that time to sort of simply walk into Afghanistan and stay there. So they haven't really acted against them. And sort of they have not tried to either change the narrative, they're not trying to change the public opinion, and the Pakistani military has been reluctant to do so, because they still view these groups as allies, whether in Afghanistan or vis-a-vis India. Second, coming to the region as being uncontrollable, I would dispute that. The Pakistani army has never tried to control that region, because they have believed that keeping that region uncontrollable was good for them vis-a-vis of their Afghan policy. What has been Pakistan's Afghanistan policy? Their Afghanistan policy has always been that the regime in Afghanistan should be anti-India and pro-Pakistan. And so they have supported the Mujahideen groups in the 70s and 80s and the Taliban after that. The problem is the presumption in Pakistan has always been that an Islamist-led Afghanistan will resolve all of Pakistan's problems. Remove India and the Indian influence from Afghanistan, it will resolve the Durand line, the border issue, it will resolve any of the security challenges. None of that has happened. And finally, the belief by Pakistan and the Afghan Taliban that the rest of the world would simply accept what happened in August 2021 in Afghanistan and move on has proven to be Pyrrhic. And so all of these sort of, chickens which have come home to roost are things which have been there for a long time in Pakistan and Afghanistan.
Absolutely.
The Afghan Taliban, sorry?
No, so it's a grand miscalculation and a failure of strategic imagination, it seems, and that's had a adverse impact now on Pakistan. It's paying the price. The chickens have come home to roost, says Dr. Aparna Pande. Viewers, I have a very interesting news report about why 2022, the year that just passed, was the worst ever at the Durand Line in terms of security incidents, and why it's so hot in terms of shelling and border conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan. And let's watch this report and continue the discussion with Dr. Pande. Viewers, you just saw how the situation at the Durand Line has significantly deteriorated. Coming back to you, Dr. Pande, why do you think the Afghan Taliban, who had received Pakistani establishment support for so many decades, why are they now becoming so assertive and non-cooperative? I mean, we all remember the famous image of the Pakistani intelligence chief arriving triumphantly in Kabul in August 2021 when the Afghan Taliban took over, and openly joking with reporters, as if they had conquered the country. And now it looks like Afghanistan is rebuffing Pakistan so openly, and the clashes show that it's getting worse and worse. And this kind of situation was unexpected, because most analysts predicted that it was a victory for Pakistan, and they thought the Afghan Taliban takeover was a grand success for Pakistani strategy. But now it's completely boomeranged on them. So how do you explain the increasing conflict between Afghanistan and Pakistan?
Actually, Sreeram, I would disagree. I mean, I'm one of those who for years has written, and I wrote in my dissertation about 12 years ago, that those who follow Afghanistan have long warned that no regime in Kabul has ever accepted the Durand Line, which is the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan. Taliban 1.0 did not accept it, and we need to remember that, but people have forgotten because it's so many years ago. And there was little likelihood that Taliban 2.0 would do that. So there were many of us who were warning the Taliban will not listen to Pakistan. They will not accept the Durand Line. This was sort of Pakistan. There was a lot more of this belief in Pakistan that now we finally resolved, but it wasn't. It was a Pyrrhic victory. The border conflict has to do with every Afghan regime refusing to accept what they refer to as a border which was imposed on them by the British. And so they have not accepted it. But the Afghan Taliban have not turned against Pakistan. They are simply doing what they have always done the last time round and what they've always said they would do for decades. It's just that no one believed what they said. They thought it was their ideology. They thought they would change when they came into power. People moderate when they come to power. But that's a fallacy. The Taliban have a strong ideological belief system, and they have refused to change it. Similarly, they refuse to recognize the Durand Line, and they won't recognize it. But I do not see all-out war, because the Afghan Taliban are dependent on Pakistan, and Pakistan would not want two borders to be alive. And so what is most likely is that we will see a continuation of the tensions on the border, continuation of rhetoric from both sides with no easy resolution. And for Pakistan, it's just going to become tougher in the coming days and months.
Yeah. And Dr. Pande, Prime Minister Shahbaz Sharif of Pakistan, first comment after the Peshawar mosque attack was that terrorism is the #1 security challenge of our country. It's not India anymore. They're saying it's terrorism. So perhaps belatedly at least, they do realize the Frankensteins, the monsters that they created are coming back to bite them. But now what is interesting is, you said that there's no likelihood of all-out war, and that's probably realistic. But then if Pakistan is tied down at the Durand line so much through these incidents and more force projection and counterinsurgency operations and all that, the question is, what does this do to the jihadist groups? I mean, do they coalesce around the religious fundamentalist ideology and strike even more, or can they how do you foresee the militancy situation there going forward in the coming months and years? Because clearly there's this lawless area, as it always was, but then it seems to be creeping even into the Punjab province. There is a talk about how there is an anti-Tehreek-e-Taliban operations being carried out by Pakistani police and intelligence in Punjab province, which is the heart of Pakistan, far away from the border.
Actions inside Punjab actually are not new. When the TTP first arose, and let's go back some years, most of the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan recruits used to come from Punjab and then from Northwest Frontier or Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. So there has been a strong link between Punjab and the border terror groups. This is not new. Even at the time, soon after and around the Army Public School attack. And if we recall, let's go back to 2009, there was an attack on the Pakistani Army headquarters and the ISI headquarters. And the groups which were involved in that were actually from Punjab. They were not from the border areas in Pakistan. And so there's been an old link. Let's not forget that the groups which attack India in Kashmir and all of this, Lashkar-e-Taiba and Jaish-e-Mohammed, have strong roots in Punjab. So Punjab has long had a history of recruitment for mosques and madrasas, which have sent terrorist groups, not just to India, but also for Afghanistan and now for within Pakistan. So has Pakistani society radicalized over the years? Yes, it has. Does Pakistan face a bigger threat today than it did a decade or two? Definitely it does, because the state is weaker, the economy is worse, there's less global attention to Pakistan. With the Afghan Taliban next door, the jihadi groups inside Pakistan believe that if the Afghan Taliban can come to power, even if it took them a few decades, then we can do the same inside Pakistan. So Pakistan's security is getting worse. And yes, it will have an impact on its neighbors. We've already seen inside Kashmir, right? There are reports that arms which used to be used in Afghanistan have found their way inside Kashmir. And if we go back to the late 1980s, early 1990s, when insurgency started in Kashmir, a lot of the groups and fighters who were fighting in Afghanistan against the Soviets had then decided to move or were directed by the Pakistani establishment to go and fight inside Kashmir. Yeah. So insecurity will increase, and all these groups will create a bigger problem.
So state weakness, viewers, Dr. Aparna Pande is saying that Pakistani state weakness does not necessarily mean that the jihadi threat is going to somewhat lessen for India. In fact, the so-called loose or lawless elements continue to grow and fester in the context of state weakness. And of course, Afghanistan is what's looking at now, because it's not just a bilateral issue between Pakistan and India. The real issue is what are India's relations with Afghanistan. And 2021, the Afghan Taliban takeover in Kabul was seen as a big rupture and a break, or even as a big strategic setback for India. That's how many people saw it. But increasingly, the Taliban have been making overtures to India, and India has also stepped up in terms of humanitarian assistance and is looking to support the Afghan people. Let's hear from a senior official of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs in the UN Security Council in December 2022, talking about India's priorities in Afghanistan. Let's hear him and then return to the discussion.
On the political front, India continues to call for an inclusive dispensation in Afghanistan, which represents all sections of the Afghan society. A broad-based, inclusive, and representative formation is necessary for long-term peace and stability in Afghanistan and in turn for economic recovery and development. As a close neighbor, Afghanistan will continue to remain in our hearts, and we will continue to speak out in support of the Afghan people. The days when Afghanistan was used by others for a so-called strategic depth are over. Such skewed approaches have only brought misery to the people of Afghanistan and the mayhem in the region. Peace and stability in Afghanistan are critical imperatives that all of us need to collectively strive for. India will continue to play its role in pursuit of this objective. The interest of the Afghan people will always continue to be at the core of our efforts today and always.
So, interests of the Afghan people always foremost for India, says Mr. Sanjay Verma, Secretary West of Ministry of External Affairs at the United Nations. Dr. Pande, you see, we seem to have lost the plot when the Afghan Taliban took over in 2021. But it looks like this perfect storm between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which we've been discussing, may be creating an opportunity for India to claw its way back and to stage a comeback in Afghanistan. And the Taliban have said that they want India to invest in urban projects and to help with continuation of the unfinished developmental works that we had done when the previous UN recognized government was there. And we have opened our embassy, the chargé d'affaires there, not yet an ambassador. But the point is, India seems to be, as the contradictions grow between Pakistan and Afghanistan, Taliban ruled Afghanistan, it looks like better tidings geopolitically, or opportunities are opening up for India. Of course, India has taken a stance about the human rights issue in Afghanistan and about status of women and all that. But when it comes to the core realpolitik, it looks like the Pakistan-Afghanistan clash or tensions do create a chance for India, right? I mean, that is something that we should be looking to exploit, do you think? Or how do you think India should be approaching this fracas at the Durand line and between these two neighbors?
I think we must remember that at the end of the day, India's strength and India's influence in Afghanistan comes from its soft power. Afghans love Indians, and the reason is because of the massive amount of developmental assistance, humanitarian assistance we have given Afghanistan over the decades, the old historical ties, the fact that many Afghans have studied in India, and the fact that even today, India continues to give humanitarian aid, developmental assistance to Afghans, and we must continue with that. That is what at many levels ensured that irrespective of what Pakistan tried to do in Afghanistan, the majority of Afghans continued to like India and Indians. And that will irrespective of whether the Taliban stays or Taliban goes in the coming decades, we should continue our relationship with the Afghan people. However, can we leverage the friction? I would be wary on that, and I'm skeptical. The Taliban are not pragmatic people. Yes, they need development assistance. They have no knowledge on how to operate or run dams and projects. They are not their biggest problem is that both Afghan Taliban and Pakistani state believed that once the dust was settled and the Americans withdrew, the global community would simply accept the reality and allow trade and aid, and the Taliban would have access to funds and they would be legitimized. That hasn't happened. Most humanitarian groups have withdrawn and left recently as the Taliban's own actions have made it worse and very difficult. So India is one of the few countries whose aid continues, and India will continue to do that. But the Taliban are ideological, and their ideological allies are the Pakistani Taliban and the Pakistani state. They are not India. And so their view of India will remain the same as the view of any jihadi group towards India. And so India's ally, India can have a tactical relationship with the Afghan Taliban simply to provide aid and assistance. But beyond that, India's allies will always remain the people on the street, the educated Afghans, and the nationalist resistance.
Absolutely. And of course, one must not forget that the Afghanistan itself is going through a severe crisis that's even bigger in magnitude than what Pakistan is facing. And Taliban are unable to prevent attacks on foreigners in Afghanistan. And even the Pakistani embassy in Kabul itself has been attacked by one of the so-called ISIS-linked groups. So yes, it's a pervasive insecurity, as I said, viewers, and Dr. Aparna Pande is saying that India must still be wary and watch out for the ideological threats that these groups pose. And of course, they are also quite potent and could potentially reignite fires in Kashmir, and we are on the watch out for that. The point is, Afghanistan, Pakistan, both are down in the dumps. And that's not great news, because you have millions of young people who are looking for a purpose and looking for a livelihood, and who could be lured into the terrorism business. So it's not good news at all. But nonetheless, the Pakistan-Afghanistan clash is worth studying, because that possibly contains a grain of hope. I want to thank Dr. Aparna Pande for sharing wonderful insights and expertise. Thank you so much, Dr. Pande.
Thank you, Sreeram. Pleasure to be with you.
So viewers, do you think about Afghanistan-Pakistan border, the terrorism problem, AFPAC as the Americans used to call it, is smoldering. It is burning, and it's going to get a lot worse before you can possibly see any stability or peace in that region. And the cross currents of it will affect India, and we need to be proactively involved in trying to shape the outcomes in that region. But there are limits to how much we can do when there are hardcore jihadis ruling in both these countries. So keep watching Indian Diplomacy, and I'll see you again next time. Take care.